Margaret Sullivan was 68 years old, gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, deep lines around her eyes, arthritic hands that trembled slightly when she signed her intake papers. She moved slowly through the processing line, her prison-issued jumpsuit hanging loose on her thin frame. The younger inmates at Redwood Women's Correctional snickered as she shuffled past. "They putting grandmas in max security now?" one called out. "Probably wrote a bad check," another laughed. By the end of her first day, the Viper Queens had marked her. They ran C-Block with an iron fist, extortion, contraband, brutal enforcement. Their leader, a 32-year-old lifer named Jade Martinez, had killed 2 women in prison fights and walked away each time. Jade cornered Margaret in the showers after lights out, 4 of her crew blocking the exits. "Old woman," Jade hissed, grabbing Margaret's collar and slamming her against the tile wall. "You got Social Security checks coming in? Family sending money? Whatever you got, 50% is mine. Or we make your last years very, very painful." Margaret's trembling hands went still. She looked up at Jade with eyes that had seen things no grandmother should see. "Let go of me," Margaret said, her voice suddenly cold, stripped of any elderly frailty. "This is your only warning." Jade laughed. "Or what, Grandma? You gonna—" She never finished the sentence. "Stay with me until the end, because what this 68-year-old woman does in the next 5 seconds will send Jade to the infirmary, dismantle the most feared gang in the prison, and reveal a military record so classified that even the warden doesn't have clearance to read it. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started." The processing officer at Redwood Women's Correctional had seen every type of inmate walk through those steel doors. Gang members covered in tattoos, corporate fraudsters in expensive suits, drug dealers with dead eyes and expensive dental work. What he hadn't expected was Margaret Sullivan. Her intake form read like a mistake: assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, possession of military-grade explosives. The charges seemed impossible when he looked at the frail woman standing before him. Her hands shook as she held her ID card. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she answered his questions. Everything about her screamed harmless elderly woman who had somehow gotten caught up in something beyond her understanding. The officer processed hundreds of inmates every month. His job was to catalog their belongings, assign them to cell blocks, and move them through the system as efficiently as possible. He didn't have time to wonder about their stories or question the paperwork that crossed his desk. Margaret Sullivan was prisoner number 46792, and that was all that mattered to him. But if that officer had taken the time to read beyond the basic charges, he might have noticed something unusual about Margaret's file. A section marked "Classified" that required security clearance he didn't possess. References to military service that spanned 3 decades. Deployment records to places that didn't officially exist on any map. Commendations from generals whose names were blacked out with permanent marker. Margaret had been many things before those steel doors closed behind her. A daughter who lost her parents in a car accident at 17. A young woman who enlisted in the army to escape poverty and found her calling in the shadows of covert operations. A soldier who spent 32 years in units that didn't officially exist, handling problems that governments couldn't solve through conventional means. A warrior who had earned the respect of hardened special forces operators who called her the Iron Grandmother long before her hair turned gray. Now she was just another number in an orange jumpsuit, assigned to C-Block in a maximum security facility that housed the most dangerous women in the state correctional system. C-Block was ruled by fear, and everyone understood the hierarchy. The Viper Queens controlled every aspect of daily life behind these walls. They decided who got protection and who became prey. They determined which inmates received medical attention and which ones suffered in silence. They controlled the flow of contraband, the allocation of commissary privileges, and most importantly, they controlled who lived and who died. Jade Martinez had built her empire through calculated brutality. She stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, with arms that told stories of every victory she had claimed inside these walls. Her reputation was built on 2 principles: show no mercy to those who challenged her authority, and make examples of anyone foolish enough to test her resolve. The guards looked the other way because Jade's iron rule kept the other inmates in line, making their jobs easier and their shifts safer. When word spread through C Block that new blood was arriving, Jade's interest was immediately piqued. Fresh inmates represented opportunities to expand her influence and demonstrate her power to anyone who might be watching. New faces meant new sources of income through her protection racket and her contraband smuggling operation. The first time Jade laid eyes on Margaret Sullivan, she couldn't have been more pleased. An elderly woman who moved like every step caused her pain. Someone who kept her eyes downcast and spoke only when spoken to directly. This wasn't just easy money walking through her territory. This was a gift wrapped in prison orange that would provide entertainment for her crew and profit for her operation. Margaret's first week was exactly what she intended it to be. She followed every rule without complaint. She kept her cell organized with military precision despite her apparent frailty. She attended every mandatory activity and meal without drawing attention to herself. To everyone watching, she was just another broken woman serving out her final years behind bars. But Margaret was conducting her own intelligence-gathering operation. She learned the guard rotation schedules and their individual personalities. She identified the blind spots in the camera coverage throughout C Block. She cataloged the weapons that inmates had fashioned from everyday items. Most importantly, she studied the Viper Queens and their operational patterns with the same analytical precision she had once used to dismantle terrorist cells in countries whose names couldn't be spoken aloud. Her cellmate was a nervous woman named Rosa, who had been counting down the days to her release for 8 months. Rosa whispered constantly about the dangers lurking in every corner of the facility. She provided detailed warnings about which inmates to avoid, which guards could be trusted, and which areas of the prison were controlled by rival gangs. "You seem different from the others who come through here," Rosa said one night after lights out. "Most new inmates, they're either scared out of their minds or trying to prove how tough they are from day one. You just seem like you're waiting for something to happen." Margaret stared at the concrete ceiling where shadows from the corridor lights created geometric patterns in the darkness. "Patience is something most people never master," she said quietly. "But it's usually the difference between surviving and thriving." Rosa didn't understand what that meant, but something in Margaret's tone made her feel both protected and worried at the same time. The prison cafeteria was where power dynamics played out 3 times a day. Jade held court at the center table, surrounded by her lieutenants who competed for her attention and approval. Every meal was an opportunity to remind the population who controlled their daily existence, who deserved respect, and who deserved to be crushed under her boot. Margaret entered the cafeteria each morning with the same measured steps she used everywhere else. She collected her tray without complaint, accepted whatever food was being served that day, and found an empty table where she could eat in peace while observing every conversation, every alliance, every subtle threat that passed between the other inmates. The food was exactly what she expected from an underfunded correctional facility that prioritized cost over nutrition. Watery eggs that had been sitting under heat lamps since before dawn, toast that crumbled at the slightest touch, coffee that looked like it had been brewing since the previous evening. She ate without complaint because she had consumed far worse during military operations in places where supply lines didn't exist. For 2 weeks, this routine continued without incident. Margaret blended into the background of prison life like wallpaper that nobody noticed or remembered. Just another elderly inmate serving her time and staying out of trouble. But Jade was growing restless with each passing day. The new inmate was too quiet, too composed, too comfortable in an environment that should have terrified someone her age. That kind of calm suggested experience with violence that Jade couldn't quite place. In her world, people who showed no fear usually had very good reasons for their confidence, and that made them either valuable assets or threats that needed to be eliminated before they could establish themselves. The morning Jade decided to make her move, the atmosphere in C Block felt different. Conversations were more subdued than usual. Inmates glanced around nervously like prey animals sensing a predator. Even the guards seemed more alert, though none of them could have explained the source of their unease. Margaret sensed the change the moment she woke up. 32 years of military service had taught her to read environments, to feel the subtle shifts in energy that preceded violence. She made her bed, with hospital corners, arranged her few possessions with precise spacing, and prepared for what she knew was coming. The shower block after lights out was where the Viper Queens conducted their most serious business. No cameras, no guards, no witnesses who would risk their lives to testify about what they might have seen. It was Jade's personal interrogation chamber, the place where she broke spirits and established absolute dominance over anyone foolish enough to challenge her authority. Margaret entered the shower area alone, carrying a small towel and a bar of state-issued soap. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows between the concrete walls, creating a maze of blind spots where anything could happen. She moved slowly, maintaining the facade of frailty that had served her so well during her first 2 weeks behind bars. Jade emerged from the shadows with 4 of her most trusted lieutenants. These weren't street gang wannabes or desperate addicts looking for protection. These were hardened killers who had earned their positions through demonstrated brutality. Women who had survived multiple prison riots, who had carved out territories through systematic violence, who viewed inflicting pain as both profession and pleasure. "Thought you could avoid me forever, old woman?" Jade's voice echoed off the tile walls. "Time for your orientation to how things really work in my house." Margaret set down her towel and soap with deliberate care, her movements still betraying the tremor of advanced age. "I was hoping we could discuss this like civilized people." The response triggered laughter from Jade's crew. The idea that civilization existed in this place was absurd to women who had long ago abandoned any pretense of humanity. They had evolved beyond social contracts, beyond mercy, beyond anything except the raw exercise of power over the powerless. Civilized. Jade stepped closer, her massive frame casting a shadow that engulfed Margaret completely. "Grandma, this ain't Sunday dinner at the church. This is my world, and in my world, respect gets paid in blood or money. Since you don't look like you got much fight in you, let's talk about your money." Margaret's hands stopped trembling completely. Her posture straightened almost imperceptibly. When she spoke, her voice carried authority that seemed to emerge from nowhere. "I don't have any money. Everyone's got something," one of Jade's lieutenants snarled, stepping forward with a sharpened piece of metal glinting in her hand. "Family on the outside. Social security. Something we can work with." "My family is dead," Margaret said simply. "My social security gets deposited into an account I can't access from here. I have nothing to offer you except problems you don't want." Jade's eyes narrowed. The old woman's tone had changed completely. Gone was the quavering voice of a frightened elderly inmate. In its place was something cold, professional, dangerous. It was the voice of someone who had given orders that resulted in people disappearing permanently. "Problems?" Jade laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "Lady, you're looking at the biggest problem in this entire facility. I've killed women twice your size with my bare hands. I've run this block for 6 years because nobody, and I mean nobody, has the balls to challenge me directly." Margaret studied each of the women surrounding her with calculating precision. Her eyes moved like a sniper selecting targets, cataloging weaknesses, identifying pressure points that could be exploited in seconds. 6 years is a long time to be in charge. Must be exhausting to maintain that level of control through constant violence. The observation was delivered with clinical detachment, that unnerved everyone present. It wasn't mockery or fear, it was analysis. Professional assessment of an operational environment by someone who understood power structures from a perspective that went far beyond prison politics. "You think you're smart?" Jade grabbed Margaret's collar and slammed her against the concrete wall with enough force to crack ribs. "Let me educate you about how intelligence works in here. Smart gets you dead, tough gets you respect, and respect gets you everything else." Margaret's feet left the ground as Jade lifted her against the wall. To anyone watching, it looked like a massive predator toying with helpless prey. The elderly woman's body appeared fragile and defenseless in the gang leader's grip. Her legs dangled uselessly. Her breathing seemed labored from the impact. But Margaret's eyes remained perfectly calm. They were the eyes of someone who had been in far worse situations and survived through skills that these women couldn't imagine. Eyes that had watched warlords fall and terrorist networks collapse through careful application of violence that left no traces. "This is your last chance to do this the easy way," Jade hissed, her face inches from Margaret's. "Tell me, what resources you got, or I start breaking bones until you remember something useful." Margaret met her gaze without flinching. "I told you to let go of me. That was your warning. What happens next is your choice." The words were spoken with such quiet certainty that Jade felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Doubt. This wasn't the response she expected from someone being brutalized by the most feared woman in the facility. There was no pleading, no bargaining, no desperate promises, just calm acceptance of whatever was about to unfold. "My choice?" Jade's grip tightened. "My choice is to teach you what respect looks like when you're bleeding on this floor." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 32 years, special operations, classified missions in 17 countries, 143 confirmed kills, 0 failures. Each word was delivered with surgical precision. "I came here to serve my sentence quietly. But if you insist on making this personal, I'll accommodate your request." The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Margaret's apparent frailty evaporated like morning mist. Her body language shifted from victim to predator in the space between heartbeats. The tremor in her hands disappeared completely. Her breathing became controlled and rhythmic. Most unsettling of all, her eyes changed from frightened grandmother to something that belonged in a war zone. Jade's crew recognized the shift immediately. They had seen killers before, but this was different. This was someone who had turned violence into art form, who had spent decades perfecting techniques that went far beyond street fighting or prison brawling. This was a professional who had operated in shadows where failure meant more than death. "You're lying," Jade said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Old women don't have military records like that." "Check my file," Margaret said calmly. "Ask the warden why most of my service history is classified above his clearance level. Ask him why the FBI escorts who brought me here wouldn't discuss my case with anyone inside this facility." The mention of FBI escorts sent a chill through the shower block. None of them had heard about federal involvement in Margaret's arrest or transfer. Standard inmates arrived through state transportation systems. Federal escorts suggested something far more serious than the assault charges on her public record. Jade's grip loosened slightly, as doubt became fear. She had built her reputation on reading people, on identifying threats and neutralizing them before they could challenge her authority. But she couldn't read this woman at all. Margaret Sullivan was operating on a level that transcended prison politics entirely. "Even if that's true," Jade said, trying to regain control of the situation, "you're still one old lady surrounded by 5 of us. Military training don't mean much when you're outnumbered and outgunned." Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving at Redwood. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Would you like to test that theory?" The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Jade's crew shifted positions, preparing for what they assumed would be a brief and brutal demonstration of their leader's dominance. These women had witnessed countless beatdowns in this same shower block. They had seen tough inmates reduced to sobbing victims within minutes. They expected nothing different from this frail grandmother who had somehow wandered into their territory. Margaret remained perfectly still against the concrete wall. Her breathing was controlled, measured, like someone preparing for meditation rather than violence. The tremor that had defined her movements for 2 weeks was completely absent now. Her hands hung at her sides with the relaxed readiness of someone who understood that true power came from stillness, not aggression. "Last chance, old woman," Jade snarled, drawing back her fist. "Tell me what you got, or I start breaking things that don't heal right at your age." Margaret's response was barely audible. "You should have walked away." What happened next would be discussed in hushed whispers throughout Redwood for years to come. Margaret's left hand moved with surgical precision, intercepting Jade's massive fist and redirecting it harmlessly past her head. The movement was so fluid it seemed choreographed, like a dance partner guiding someone through steps they didn't know they were performing. Simultaneously, Margaret's right palm struck upward into Jade's solar plexus with devastating accuracy. The technique was called a disruption strike, designed to temporarily paralyze the diaphragm without causing permanent damage. Applied correctly, it could drop someone twice Margaret's size. Applied with lethal force, it could stop a heart entirely. Margaret held back just enough to keep Jade breathing. Jade's eyes went wide as every molecule of air exploded from her lungs. Her massive frame folded forward like a building collapsing in slow motion. She dropped to her knees on the wet concrete, gasping desperately for oxygen that wouldn't come. The woman who had terrorized C-Block for 6 years was reduced to a helpless figure struggling for basic survival. The shower block fell into absolute silence. Even the steady drip of water from broken faucets seemed to pause in recognition of what had just occurred. Jade's crew stood frozen, their minds unable to process the impossible scene playing out before them. Their invincible leader was on her knees, defeated by a grandmother who looked like she should be knitting sweaters somewhere. Margaret stepped away from the wall, her movements now revealing the fluid grace that had been hidden beneath her facade of frailty. She was no longer the trembling, elderly woman who had shuffled through intake processing. This was someone who had spent decades perfecting violence as a precision instrument, who had learned to read human anatomy like a technical manual. "Crystal, step back," Margaret said calmly, addressing one of Jade's lieutenants by name. The woman obeyed automatically, too shocked to question how this newcomer knew her identity. Margaret had been observing, cataloging, learning about each member of the crew since her first day behind bars. The lieutenant named Razor recovered first from the group paralysis. She was Jade's most trusted enforcer, a woman who had earned her nickname through creative use of makeshift weapons. Her hand moved toward the sharpened metal concealed in her waistband, but Margaret was already turning to face her. "I wouldn't," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Your leader is having trouble breathing. She needs medical attention, not more violence." Razor hesitated, torn between her instinct to attack and her recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamics of the shower block. The old woman's tone suggested consequences that went beyond anything Razor had experienced in her years of prison violence. "You got lucky," Razor said, but her voice lacked conviction. "One surprise hit don't make you tough." Margaret studied her with the clinical assessment she had once used to evaluate enemy combatants in hostile territory. Luck had nothing to do with what just happened. Your leader made the mistake of believing that age equals weakness. You're about to make the same error in judgment. The warning was delivered without hostility or anger. It was simply information, like a weather report predicting rain. But something in Margaret's tone made Razor's hand move away from her weapon. She had heard that same detached professionalism from killers before. People who viewed violence as a job requirement rather than an emotional outlet. Jade was finally managing to draw shallow breaths, though she remained on her hands and knees on the concrete floor. The humiliation of her position was almost worse than the physical pain. Every inmate in C-Block would hear about this within hours. Her reputation for invincibility was crumbling with each second she spent gasping on the shower room floor. "Help her up," Margaret instructed the crew, her voice taking on the tone of someone issuing orders to subordinates. "Get her to the medical unit. Tell them she had a respiratory incident." Nothing more. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. They were accustomed to following Jade's commands, but their leader was in no condition to give orders. The elderly woman who had just dismantled their power structure with surgical precision was now directing their actions with natural authority. "Why?" Crystal asked suspiciously. "Why you helping her after what she tried to do?" Margaret began washing her hands in one of the functioning sinks, her movements methodical and unhurried. "Because unlike your leader, I understand the difference between necessary force and unnecessary cruelty. She challenged me. I responded appropriately. The matter is settled." The concept of proportional response was foreign to women who had survived through overwhelming brutality. In their world, conflicts escalated until one party was completely destroyed. The idea that violence could be calibrated, controlled, and concluded without maximum damage was alien to their understanding of prison dynamics. Two of the crew members helped Jade to her feet, supporting her weight as she struggled to maintain consciousness. Her face was flushed red from oxygen deprivation, and her eyes held a mixture of rage and fear that none of them had ever seen before. The Queen of C Block had been dethroned in less than 5 seconds by someone she had dismissed as easy prey. "This ain't over," Jade wheezed as they prepared to escort her from the shower block. "You got no idea what you just started." Margaret dried her hands on her small towel with deliberate care. "Actually, I ended what you started. The question now is whether you're intelligent enough to learn from this experience or foolish enough to repeat your mistakes." The clinical assessment hit Jade like another physical blow. She was being evaluated like a failed operation, dismissed as irrelevant by someone who operated on a completely different level. The grandmother's tone suggested that tonight's encounter was merely a minor inconvenience, easily handled and quickly forgotten. As the crew helped their leader toward the exit, Margaret called out one final instruction. "Tell the medical staff she needs a chest X-ray. The technique I used can cause delayed complications if not properly monitored." The casual mention of potential complications sent another chill through the departing group. Margaret hadn't just defended herself. She had demonstrated knowledge of exactly how much damage her strike could cause and what medical attention might be required. This was someone who understood violence with scientific precision. The shower block fell quiet, except for the steady drip of water and the distant echo of footsteps retreating down the corridor. Margaret finished her washing routine and began walking back toward her cell, moving with the same measured pace she had maintained since arriving at Redwood. To anyone observing, she appeared to be just another elderly inmate completing her evening hygiene routine. But word was already spreading through C Block like wildfire. Whispered conversations in cells, hurried exchanges during guard rotations, urgent messages passed through the complex communication network that connected every corner of the facility. The impossible had happened. Jade Martinez, the untouchable queen of maximum security, had been taken down by a grandmother who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. By morning, Margaret's reputation had transformed completely. Inmates who had ignored her presence now watched her movements with careful respect. Guards found themselves paying closer attention to the elderly woman who walked the corridors with quiet confidence. Even the medical staff treating Jade's mysterious respiratory incident began asking questions about the new inmate who had somehow predicted exactly what treatment would be needed. Rosa was waiting in their cell when Margaret returned, her face a mixture of terror and amazement. "They're saying you put Jade in the infirmary. They're saying you did something to her that the doctors can't explain." Margaret sat on her narrow bunk and began preparing for sleep with the same routine she had followed since arriving at Redwood. "People say many things in places like this. Most of it isn't worth repeating. But what you did to her, that wasn't normal. Nobody fights like that. Nobody moves like that." Margaret paused in her preparations, her eyes distant with memories of training sessions that lasted until dawn, of missions that required her to become someone else entirely, of a world where her skills were used to solve problems that governments couldn't handle through conventional means. I was trained to neutralize threats efficiently and with minimal collateral damage, she said finally. Sometimes that training proves useful in unexpected circumstances. Rosa stared at her cellmate with new understanding. What kind of training turns a grandmother into someone who can take down Jade Martinez with one hit? The kind most people hope they never need. The next morning brought a different atmosphere to C Block entirely. Conversations were more cautious. Alliances were being reconsidered, and the power vacuum left by Jade's humiliation was creating opportunities for ambitious inmates who had previously operated in the shadows. The Viper Queens were scattered and leaderless, their protection rackets collapsing as word spread about their leader's defeat. Margaret walked to breakfast with the same deliberate steps she always used, but now those steps carried weight that rippled through every interaction around her. Inmates moved aside without being asked. Guards nodded with newfound respect. Even the kitchen staff seemed to take more care with her meal preparation. The cafeteria felt different without Jade's imposing presence at the center table. Her crew sat together in nervous clusters, whispering about what had happened and what it meant for their future in the facility's hierarchy. Some were already making overtures to other gang leaders, seeking protection from the chaos that was sure to follow. Margaret found an empty table and sat down to eat her breakfast in the peace she had originally requested. But peace was a luxury that rarely lasted long in maximum security facilities. As she methodically consumed her eggs and toast, she noticed movement at the edges of her vision. New faces, inmates she didn't recognize from C Block, women with calculating eyes and deliberate movements who were sizing up the situation with professional interest. Word of what happened to Jade had reached beyond Redwood's walls through the complex network of connections that linked correctional facilities across 3 states. Margaret's name was being whispered in maximum security cells and protective custody units alike. The grandmother who had taken down the infamous Jade Martinez with techniques that seemed to belong in military manuals rather than prison fights. That kind of reputation attracted attention from people who made Jade look like an amateur in comparison. 3 women approached Margaret's table as she finished her breakfast. The leader was tall, with graying hair and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence spanning multiple decades. They called her Iron Kate, and her reputation preceded her through every maximum security facility in the region. "Mind if we sit?" Kate asked, though it wasn't really a question. Her 2 companions flanked the table, blocking potential escape routes with practiced efficiency. Margaret looked up from her tray, her expression unchanged. "The cafeteria belongs to everyone. Please join me." Kate settled into the chair across from Margaret, her movements deliberate and threatening. "Polite, I appreciate that. Shows respect for experience." She leaned forward slightly. "We heard about your disagreement with Jade. Impressive demonstration of technique. It was a misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily," Margaret replied calmly. "Misunderstanding." Kate laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Sweetheart, I've been in this system for 28 years. I know the difference between a misunderstanding and a professional takedown." Margaret set down her plastic spoon and folded her hands in her lap. Years of experience had taught her to recognize genuine threats, and this woman represented danger on a level that Jade never could have imagined. "I'm not looking for additional complications. I simply want to serve my sentence without interference." Margaret Sullivan served the remainder of her sentence without another incident, not because she couldn't handle whatever came next, but because after that night in the shower block, nobody was foolish enough to test her again. Word had spread through every facility in 3 states. The Iron Grandmother wasn't just a legend anymore. She was a warning. When Margaret walked out of Redwood 18 months later, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her incarceration. The guards who processed her release spoke in respectful whispers. The inmates who watched her leave did so with a mixture of relief and admiration. Even Iron Kate nodded with genuine respect as Margaret passed through the final security checkpoint. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who never wanted to fight at all. Sometimes when you pick on the quiet one, you discover that silence isn't weakness, it's patience. And when that patience finally runs out, you learn why some people choose to stay quiet in the first place. The next time you see someone being underestimated because of their age, their appearance, or their quiet demeanor, remember Margaret Sullivan. Remember that everyone has a story, and some stories are written in shadows that most people never see. Thanks for watching. If this story reminded you never to judge a book by its cover, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. And remember, respect is earned, but it should never have to be taken by force.